For more reaction to the federal government's Religious Discrimination Bill, we're joined by Giancarlo de Vera, president of the national peak body, which advocates for LGBTQI+ people of multicultural and multi-faith backgrounds. Giancarlo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy.
There's a really interesting intersection here of people from multicultural backgrounds, people of faith who also identify as members of the LGBTQI+ community. Have you got a sense of how they're digesting this bill and this proposal?
Yeah, to be honest with you, the ability to process what this bill means for our community is incredibly complex, and we haven't really had the time to think about how this impacts us. What we do know, however, Jeremy, is that we have a right to practice our faith and our religion. And what the bill is currently doing is framing this conversation around our ability to practice our faith in a way that is in opposition to our identities as LGBTQI people. And that's a concern to us. And we're not too sure if this bill does that right. And what this also potentially does, this bill that is highlight even more tensions within the community, because we already know that people who are multicultural and multi-faith, as well as LGBTQI, are experiencing discrimination from various pressure points and from various sources, and how that's going to inflame the situation is something that we're really worried about.
Are you seeing evidence of that being inflammatory in a religious setting, and how are those communities interacting, people of faith interacting with members of their congregations, of their communities who do identify as gay, lesbian, bi, transgender, intersex, queer?
Yeah, we are absolutely seeing people being discouraged and excluded from their religious communities and from their, as well as their cultural communities, because sometimes these communities intersect. And what we're concerned about here is how is this going to make it easier or worse? In fact, we'd probably say it's going to make it worse. And how do we ensure that people aren't excluded from practicing the religion to the point where they get pushed out, to the point where they actually feel excluded, to the point where they can get to a pointy situation? And one of the things that we're really finding quite interesting at the moment is how these messages of exclusion from all sources, from our faith communities, from our religious communities, from our queer communities, as well as our family groups, are causing us to feel like we don't belong anywhere.
So you're feeling this on multiple fronts, but this is a good point to clarify. You're not opposed to the legislation preventing discrimination against people on the basis of their faith. This is not about preventing others from practicing their faith or necessarily expressing their views, is that right?
Yeah, well, we are in support of a bill that protects the right to religion, and that's something that we want to see. But we don't think this bill achieves that. We think this bill could be simplified without making concessions to communities that we represent at AGMC. The opportunity there is something that allows us to be able to practice our faith, but at the same time ensuring that we aren't excluded in our communities.
There is a fair bit of government funding that goes to organisations that identify as being of a particular religious persuasion. Where does this leave those organisations in being able to express those views, to express that right to discriminate against who they hire, who they don't, who they educate, who they don't, and receive government funding at the same time?
That's a really tricky question. I think part of the concern with this bill is the statement of belief provisions in the bill, and what we're concerned about is the entirely subjective nature of those provisions. And so when I think of places like schools, like workplaces, I'm worried about these duty holders not being able to balance their duty to ensure that we feel safe. At the moment, we don't feel safe. We are excluded. Most of us feel like we're excluded from these places and in these settings, and this, I think, will probably make it worse.
There's a question too about how those statements of belief provisions would be policed and regulated, right?
That's right, absolutely. And that's what I'm really worried about. We're not too sure how that's going to be regulated. How is the school going to ensure that someone is able to be queer in a religious school while having the opportunities to be exposed to potentially harmful comments in their workplace? How do they manage the safety of that employee? I don't know if they can.
The timing of this bill is really interesting too, because this has been in the works ever since the passage of same-sex marriage legislation, and it comes now really on the eve of a federal election campaign. Do you see this becoming an election issue?
Jeremy, absolutely. We've known about this intention to introduce the bill since June, and we've raised serious concerns about why it's taken the Australian government so long to do so. We actually don't know if this is if this is potentially going to be helpful to our communities, because we are still feeling tired from the plebiscite. We're still feeling tired from having those conversations with our communities, and I don't think we've had a chance to heal. And so, with this potentially being a more public debate, the concern I have is that we don't have the opportunity to talk about this issue respectfully. And so one of the main reasons, and that's one of the main reasons why we're calling for this to be immediately referred to a joint select committee.
Giancarlo de Vera, so good to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy, for having me.